Okay, we're going to talk about the Reformation. Um, in a very basic way, this picture is essentially, pretty much exactly what is going on. During the Reformation, Catholics and Protestants separate and go different ways ideologically, and they never really reconcile. Um, there's not wars between them anymore, or more or less, but obviously this split after so many hundreds and hundreds of years of Catholicism has great ramifications for Western civilization. This begins with, or the break really begins with this man here on the left hand side, Martin Luther. And I'm sure you've heard the story where he nails his theses of uh, questions to the door of the Württemberg um, cathedral. And nailing these questions to the door is not really as alarming as it sounds. It's actually culturally acceptable at that time to post new ideas this way. But over time, the act has taken on this greater significance as seen as a more of a rebellious move. Anyway, Luther is upset with what he sees as gross misbehavior by members of the church, specifically two things. One is the practice of simony, and simony is the selling of positions in the church for money. So if you wanted to be a archbishop in a certain city, you could buy that office. And he's also very upset with the sale of indulgences. And indulgences are formal remission of sin. What that means, it's an actual document that says you've been forgiven for sins. And these are also for sale. The idea behind indulgences is to help someone's soul get through purgatory and on to heaven. So think back to Dante and the Divine Comedy. There's these different levels. There's hell and purgatory and heaven. And purgatory is kind of like heaven's waiting room. And Luther sees these practices as entirely unnatural. And Luther actually inspires others. He inspires John Calvin. Calvin comes up with the idea of predestination for salvation, that his idea is that it doesn't matter really what you do on this earth, you were either predestined to uh, for salvation after you die or not. And your life and the things that happen to you in your life are the evidence of that salvation. And then there's Menno Simmons. He founds the Mennonites, and these groups, the Calvinists, the Mennonites, the Lutherans, and all these other fringe Protestant groups, these guys kind of separate into their own communities and they focus on themselves and not so much the church. And they are focused on refining their ideology, not necessarily concerning themselves with what the Pope in a very distant city has to say. And they aggressively defend these ideologies. Common to many of these groups is the rejection of infant baptism. So, unlike Catholics, where they baptize a baby, um, and for Protestants, it must be an adult decision. And this is based on an understanding of someone's personal relationship with God. There's also a much more strict interpretation of biblical texts. There's more public rather than private confessions. And these ideas that you see here coming about in the early Protestants, this is really the kind of forefathers of the modern day Baptist, and I'm sure you've heard of that. Now, the spread of Protestant groups, especially Lutherans, is extremely troubling to the Catholic Church. In 1520, Pope Leo X demands that Luther and all of the others stop or suffer the consequences. He actually writes a letter. Basically, it's kind of a cease and desist type letter. And when Luther receives this, he burns the letter in public. And when he burns that letter, he becomes, depending on your point of view, he's either a hero or a villain. And in response, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V calls the Diet of Worms. And this is a um, meeting to try and decide what to do with Luther and the Lutherans and all the other Protestants. And at the Diet of Worms, the Catholics excommunicate Luther and they threaten to kill him. Now, Luther is taken in by a group of German princes. The princes are interested in their own power and expanding their own kingdoms, and they have absolutely no problem challenging the Pope, especially when they can use religion, i.e., Lutheranism, to make themselves appear more legitimate or defending a faith. And Charles V is no different. He has been working endlessly to increase his own power. He uses marriage as a tool to make his family, the Habsburgs, more powerful. And an example of this is he manages to marry his son to Joanne of Aragon. And that name, Aragon, should sound familiar to you. For Joanne is essentially the daughter of uh, Ferdinand and Isabella, same as Catherine, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And through the marriage, the Habsburgs managed to control almost all of Europe. And so Joanne's marriage to Philip the First is genius because what it does is it turns a liability, a daughter, into something politically valuable. And I don't mean that to be offensive, it's just this is the way the world functioned at this time. You needed a male child to pass down hereditary title and lands and all of this other stuff. So a daughter was actually kind of a liability. And in 1527, Charles V, he occupies Rome. And this gives him the power to pressure the Pope directly in terms of politics. And it's important to remember that the Holy Roman Emperor is a staunch Catholic. So there's these religious debates going on internally inside Europe, or the mainland Europe itself. But then outside, right on the borders, there's also um, some threats. Um, Europe is under assault from the Ottoman Empire, and this is beginning in the 1520s. This sultan here, Suleiman, he starts to consolidate Muslim lands, and he actually ends up conquering almost all of the remaining Muslim kingdoms in both Africa and the Middle East. And after this, he attempts the invasion of southern Europe. Again, we've talked some about that before as well. He lays siege to Vienna and Austria, doesn't manage to make any conquest in Europe. He's eventually repulsed, but the Ottoman Empire remains a force that continues to threaten Europe from that point onward. So you've got extra stressors that are on Western civilization at this time. They're feeling uh, potential for chaos internally because of the Protestant Reformation, and then there's also this real military threat that is coming from the outside. And the Ottoman Empire remains a kind of external political force that has to be dealt with essentially until the collapse of their empire in 1918. Now, there's a meeting of German princes at the city of Speyer in 1526, and their meeting is called the Diet of Speyer. They decide that a prince or king may make a decision on religion within his own kingdom. And this is a clear check on the power of the Pope, and it results in much confusion as these German princes grab land left and right in order to increase their power. Now, these princes are both Catholics and Protestants. So there's a tremendous amount of confusion going on. And in 1530, there is a real concern that there will develop some kind of a war between the two, Protestants and Catholics. In order to try and stop that, this man here, Philip Melanchthon, writes a document called the Augsburg Confession. And in this document, this book, he tries to explain Lutheran ideas and ideology and attempts to take a potential step toward diffusing the tension and reconciling all of this acrimony between Catholics and Protestants. Absolute failure, of course, but there is some agreement. In 1555, the Well, an agreement is issued by the Pope, and it formalizes the split between Lutherans and Catholics. And it says, it's a legal document. It says that it is okay by law to follow Luther and be a practicing Lutheran. But you must choose one or the other. You have no option other than follow Lutheranism or Catholicism. Everything else is heresy and dangerous, and you suffer the consequences. Now, this agreement is doomed from the start because it doesn't take into consideration any of the Mennonites or the Calvinists or anyone else out there who is no longer following Catholicism directly. It only leaves you two choices in terms of religion. You're either Catholic or you're Lutheran, and it leaves all the other Protestants behind. Now, Charles V is just completely disgusted with all of the religious drama that's going on here and kind of withdraws in life, dies in 1558. He leaves the title of Holy Roman Emperor to his brother Ferdinand I, but he gives the land, the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy to his son Philip II. And this will generate major conflict later on as Philip II is extremely Catholic, almost fanatically so. Now, the Reformation plays out much differently in Britain than it did with the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, talked about before, have a daughter, and her name is Mary Tudor. She is their only child. But a king, like I've said, needs a male child and a male heir. And they try to get a marriage between Mary Tudor and Charles V in the hopes that that would produce a male child, which could then succeed after the death of Henry VIII. And the problem is that Charles V flat turns them down. No way, absolutely not. He does not want to marry, um, does not want to enter into a marriage with Mary Tudor. So Henry VIII begins to worry that there could potentially have another situation like the War of the Roses that actually allowed the Tudors to come to power if there's no clear heir. And the problem is that they're all Catholic at this point, and there's no, all of their options are greatly limited because of Catholic dogma. Henry VIII appeals to Pope Clement VII for a divorce on the grounds that he never should have married his brother's widow, citing a piece of Leviticus from the Bible as evidence. And you have to remember that Catherine of Aragon was married to Henry VIII's brother um, prior to their marriage. And the Pope probably would have said yes and given him the divorce and allowed him to move on, whatever. Except you have to remember that Rome is occupied by the Holy Roman Emperor at that time, Charles V. And he says, no way. He's exercising his power of the Pope, and this leaves Henry VIII with no choice but to overhaul religion in Britain so he can find a new wife and hopefully get a male heir. Now, it puts Henry VIII in a weird position. He is advised by the Pope and advised by his Catholic advisor, his friend Thomas More, not to make changes, and he's advised by Protestant advisors, Cranmer and Cromwell, to get rid of Catholicism so he can follow his own agenda. And his friend Thomas More objects to his divorce and actually ends up being executed. The new archbishop gives Henry VIII his divorce, and there's kind of this irreparable break between England and the Pope. Henry VIII immediately marries a new woman, Anne Boleyn, and they have yet another daughter, Elizabeth. And this doesn't resolve the issue of succession. Um, Now, with the help of his Protestant advisors, Henry defunds the churches of England. He takes the money and the land for himself, and obviously this greatly increases his own personal power. 1534, it is clear that the English Reformation has moved forward to a point where there's really no going back. Henry VIII passes the Act of Supremacy, and this officially names the monarch, the English monarch, as head of the church in England. And I mean, essentially it remains that way to this very day. But the act makes it treason not to swear allegiance to the king or monarch as both head of state and head of the church. And this is what got Thomas More killed, because he could not swear allegiance to Henry VIII. As a Catholic, he had to swear allegiance to the Pope, and left Henry VIII with no option but to have More executed. But again, this document leaves him with even more power. The way this plays out is in this kind of fanatic quest for a male heir. Henry is therefore able to justify any kind of behavior um, as explain it away because he's the head of this organization. It's treason to question it, really. Um, After 3 years, there's a conspiracy against Anne Boleyn. She is executed, and Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour, and Jane Seymour bears him a son, finally, right? The son is named Edward. But Seymour dies in childbirth, so he has to find another wife. He marries Anne of Cleves on the advice of some of his closest friends and advisors. It is a total failure, and he divorces her almost immediately, and then marries Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard likely had hands in conspiracies against the king, and she ends up being executed as well. He marries the sixth and final wife, Catherine Paris, and she stays alive and actually outlives Henry VIII by 1 year. Um, the marriage to Catherine Paris is especially ironic, as she is actually named in honor of Henry VIII's first wife, who was, of course, Catherine of Aragon. Now, the real trouble begins after Henry VIII dies. There are three children by three different women. There's Mary Tudor, who is the child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. There's Elizabeth, who is the child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And then there's Edward, who is the child of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Um, Edward, being the male child, obviously becomes king. He becomes Edward VI, and he becomes king at 10 years old. He's reliably Protestant, so there isn't these kind of massive, earth-shaking changes in England. But Edward, soon after, there drops dead, and he is replaced by his stepsister, Mary Tudor. And after Mary Tudor dies, she is then turned replaced by Elizabeth, who becomes Queen Elizabeth I. We'll get to that in just a second. The real problem for England is Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor is, of course, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and she is a fanatic Catholic. She immediately reverses the Act of Supremacy and reinstates the marriage of her parents, meaning she actually produces a legal document saying uh, there was no divorce and that she now makes herself the legitimate heir. She launches a massive campaign to remove Protestant elements from society, creates strict heresy laws, and through these laws, she begins to persecute Protestants. They begin to burn thousands of Protestants at the stake, and the executions and burning at the stake earn her the nickname Bloody Mary. She executes Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was one of her father's closest advisors. And the irony of Mary Tudor is that she has essentially the exact same problem Henry VIII had, and that's no heirs that she can point to after she's gone. She marries Philip II of Spain, who's another fanatic Catholic, and all that manages to do is get England dragged into Spain's war with France. In this process of getting involved with war in France, England manages to lose all of their land in France. And it's just kind of going from bad to worse for Mary Tudor. And she has no children. She doesn't have any children, and then eventually dies. Absolutely, everybody hated her for the most part. I'm sure Catholics, some of the more staunch Catholics liked her, but the Protestants absolutely despised her for obvious reasons. And she dies in 1558. Mary Tudor is succeeded by the only surviving child of Henry VIII, and that's Elizabeth. She becomes queen in 1558. And Elizabeth is, much like her mother, Protestant. But unlike Edward VI, or Mary Tudor for that matter, she is an absolute genius when it comes to politics. In 1559, Elizabeth I reinstates the Act of Supremacy. She puts an end to this disastrous war in France, and England enters a golden period of peace which lasts until 1585. And she spends much more time governing and looking after the people than worrying about these issues of religion. And just is kind of dismissive when it comes to dogmatic issues. Um, and she becomes an extremely important figure later on. Catholics are not sitting around twiddling their thumbs while all this is happening. I mean, they do respond to the Reformation. There's what's called the Counter Reformation, where they try and organize themselves and answer some of these issues that have been proposed. In 1545, Pope Paul III calls the Council of Trent. And the idea behind this council is to kind of make affirmative statements about Catholicism. And they make some of the following decisions. Number one, the apostolic succession. And that's a fancy way of saying that all of the popes trace their lineage from St. Peter to the Pope himself. And as you saw in the paintings in the last lecture, the or excuse me, the lecture before last, um, tying yourself to St. Peter is as good as tying yourself to Christ himself. So it's if you have this succession from St. Peter to the Pope, you're really making yourself look uh, powerful and legitimate. Number two, the Latin Bible of the 4th century is the only real Bible, meaning that all of these translations that have been made, the Bible being translated into Greek, the Bible being translated into German and English, and all of this, those are not considered real Bibles because they are not in the language of Latin. Number three, good works are required for salvation, which is a direct conflict with a lot of Protestant ideas. That it doesn't matter how good you uh, are on earth or the things that you do here. It's all about that personal relationship with the divine. And number four, that scripture must be interpreted in light of church traditions. And this is absolutely um, the direct opposite of everything that Luther and the rest of the Protestants have been saying. So, what the Council of Trent means is that there will be no reconciliation. And if these are the final decisions of the Catholic hierarchy, there's no way to have a common ground between these two ideas. Both Catholics and Protestants feel threatened by the other, and they kind of move into these mutually exclusive, very hostile, um, separate camps, and they take on a more pragmatic relationship with the state than they do with their own followers, and it almost seems like politics begin to bleed into both in a way that overrides any genuine feelings toward the divine.